Hello everyone, wishing you a wonderful day. Today we're going to dive into a gripping story of love, loyalty, and survival as we uncover whether Jack and Tu Tien can overcome the company's financial collapse after serious bridge construction violations left them unable to even pay the bank interest. Will love be enough to carry them through their darkest chapter? If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next videos. Not long after the bridge collapse shook the entire town, the pressure around Jack's company only grew heavier. What had first looked like a terrible construction accident was now turning into something far worse. Investigators moved quickly. Documents were reviewed day and night, and every missing signature, altered record, and questionable material order became another piece of evidence in a case that was getting more serious by the hour. People no longer spoke about the bridge as a project that failed. They spoke about it as a scandal. And at the center of that scandal stood two names, Jack and Phuc. The morning the police arrived at the company felt unnaturally quiet at first. The office was tense, but no one expected the blow to come so directly or so fast. Employees had barely settled in when several officers stepped through the entrance with formal documents in hand. Their presence changed the air instantly. Conversations stopped. Phones were lowered. Every face in the room turned pale with uncertainty. Jack was in his office reviewing another stack of investigation records when one of his staff rushed in, breathless, barely able to get the words out. "Sir, the police are here." For one brief second, Jack said nothing. He had known this moment might come ever since the bridge collapsed. Ever since the documents began pointing toward wrongdoing in the construction process, he had understood that the case could move beyond public criticism and financial damage. But knowing it in theory was one thing. Seeing it arrive at his door was something else entirely. Jack stood up slowly, straightened his shirt, and walked out of the office. The officers introduced themselves calmly and informed him that both he and Phuc were being taken in for further investigation regarding violations in the bridge construction case. The room fell into complete silence. Some employees looked shocked. Some looked frightened. A few lowered their heads immediately, as if simply witnessing the moment made them uncomfortable. No one dared speak. Jack listened without resisting. His face remained controlled, but inside, everything felt heavy. He knew exactly what this would look like once it spread. Not just an investigation anymore, not just suspicion. This was the moment the story would change in the eyes of the public, from company crisis to criminal case. Phuc was found not long after. Unlike Jack, who stood still and accepted what was happening, Phuc looked pale and shaken the moment the officers approached him. The confidence he once carried so easily was gone. His eyes moved nervously, his voice came out uneven, and his face had the look of someone who knew the walls had finally closed in. Jack turned and looked at him for a brief second. That single look carried more pain than anger. He had once seen Phuc as a young man with drive, someone who wanted to build a future. Someone who could help carry the company through hard times. Now the same person stood beside him, not as a trusted assistant, but as one of the central figures in the investigation that had destroyed everything. When word reached Tu Tien that Jack had been taken by the police, her whole body went cold. She had already been living under a cloud of fear ever since the bridge collapsed. The scandal, the investigation, the public pressure, and Jack's silent suffering had all weighed heavily on her. But hearing that he had now been formally taken in by the police made everything feel different. More ill, more dangerous, more terrifying. For a moment, she simply stood there in disbelief. Then she started moving. She asked questions. She called everyone she thought might know something. She went to the company. She tried to understand what had happened, what the police had said, where Jack had been taken, and whether anyone had spoken to a lawyer yet. The more she asked, the more confused and overwhelmed the situation seemed. Everyone knew the case was serious, but no one seemed able to give her a clear answer about what would happen next. Still, Tu Tien refused to sit still. At the police station, Jack was questioned for hours. The room was plain, the atmosphere cold, and every question felt heavier than the one before it. The officers wanted details about the bridge project, the approval process, the material records, Phuc's role, and Jack's own level of responsibility. They placed files in front of him one after another: supplier logs, missing verification notes, internal approvals, altered records. Jack answered honestly. Yes, he had trusted Phuc too much. Yes, he had allowed too much of the project coordination to pass through internal channels without personally checking every last detail. Yes, the company had been under financial pressure during construction. No, he had not ordered any material substitutions. No, he had not knowingly approved falsified records. But no matter how truthful he tried to be, the same fact remained. The violations had happened under his company's name. That alone was enough to place him in the center of the case. In another room, Phuc was being questioned separately. And unlike Jack, Phuc did not have the same calm control. Fear was already showing on him clearly. His answers shifted. His voice shook. At moments, he tried to minimize his role. At other moments, he seemed close to admitting more than he meant to. The pressure was getting to him. By late afternoon, the news had already spread. The internet lit up with updates that Jack and Phuc had been taken in by the police. Reporters outside the station pushed out headline after headline. Public opinion turned even harsher. Some people said justice was finally beginning. Some said the arrests proved the company had been rotten from the inside all along. Others speculated wildly, adding rumors on top of facts until it became difficult to separate one from the other. Tu Tien saw those headlines, but she forced herself not to break down. This was not the time to collapse. If Jack was trapped inside that situation, then she had to be the one standing outside, searching for a way forward. She started with the most immediate thing she could think of: a lawyer. She reached out to people Jack had once worked with, asked former partners for contacts, and kept calling until she finally found someone willing to review the case urgently. She explained everything she knew: the bridge collapse, the investigation, the signs of wrongdoing in the construction process, the altered records, the role Phuc may have played, and Jack's arrest. Her voice shook more than once, but she kept going. The lawyer listened carefully and told her the same thing everyone else had been afraid to say plainly. This would not be easy. If the police believed there were serious construction violations tied to public safety, then they would proceed very carefully and very firmly. Jack's position as company head made the situation even more complicated. Even if he had not personally changed materials or falsified documents, he could still be held responsible for failures in supervision and management. Tu Tien's heart sank when she heard that. But she did not give up. Instead, she asked the only question that mattered to her: what can I do to help him? The lawyer told her to gather everything that could support Jack's side of the story. Proof that he had emphasized safety during construction. Records showing he had insisted on strict technical check. Any witness statements that might show he had not ordered corner cutting or hidden substitutions. Any evidence that could separate negligence and management from direct criminal intent. Tu Tien immediately began working. She returned to the company and searched through old files. She spoke to employees who had been on site during key stages of the bridge project. She asked about Jack's instructions, his inspections, the times he had personally emphasized that no mistakes could be hidden inside the structure once concrete was poured. Some workers remembered his warnings clearly. Some engineers confirmed that Jack had often stressed quality and safety. A few admitted they had seen Phuc handling more internal paperwork than expected near the end of the project. Every small detail mattered. That night, Tu Tien barely slept. She sat under the weak light of a lamp with papers spread around her, organizing notes, names, timelines, and anything that might help Jack. Her heart hurt every time she pictured him inside that cold room being questioned. but that pain only made her work harder. She knew this battle would not be simple. She knew love alone would not solve legal trouble. She knew the bridge collapse had already changed everything. But she also knew one thing with absolute certainty. She could not abandon Jack now. Outside, the night deepened. Inside, Tu Tien kept searching, reading, calling, and holding herself together by force. Somewhere beyond those walls, Jack was facing the heaviest moment of his life. And as the case tightened around him, only one question kept beating in her chest. Could she really find a way to help him walk free? Or was this only the beginning of a much darker road? Night had already fallen by the time Tu Tien finally stopped sorting through the stack of papers in front of her. But even then, her mind refused to rest. The small room around her was quiet, yet her thoughts were louder than ever. Every document, every note, every name she had written down seemed to carry the same weight. Somewhere out there, Jack was sitting under police questioning, and she had no idea whether he was eating, whether he was sleeping, or whether anyone was even listening to the truth he was trying to tell. But Tu Tien knew one thing clearly. If Jack had no freedom to fight for himself right now, then she had to be the one fighting for him. The next morning, she went straight back to work. She met with the lawyer again and handed over everything she had managed to gather. Records of site inspections, internal notes showing Jack had repeatedly stressed safety standards, statements from workers who remembered him warning the team that once the concrete was poured, hidden errors would become impossible to fix. Notes from engineers who confirmed that Jack had often demanded double checks on steel bars, welds, and reinforcement details. None of it was enough to erase the damage that had already happened, but it painted a more complete picture. Jack was not a man who treated safety lightly. The lawyer reviewed the documents carefully, then looked up at Tu Tien with a serious expression. "This helps," he said. "It doesn't remove his responsibility as the head of the company, but it may help show that he did not deliberately order wrongdoing. Right now, the key issue is separating management failure from direct intent." Tu Tien listened closely, even though the legal language felt cold and heavy. "So there's still a chance?" she asked. The lawyer nodded slowly. "Yes, but the case is serious, and it will depend a lot on what Phuc says, what the documents prove, and whether the investigators believe Jack acted knowingly." That answer was not comforting, but it was enough to keep her moving. From there, Tu Tien did not stop. She went to the company again. She spoke to more employees. Some were frightened and did not want to get involved. Some were still angry and confused about everything had happened. But others, especially those who had worked closely with Jack on the project, were willing to speak honestly. They remembered the pressure he had been under. They remembered how seriously he had taken the bridge during construction. They remembered him warning that this was not a small village bridge, that it was a major road structure, and that heavy trucks would pass over it every day. They remembered him saying that every steel bar and every weld mattered. The more Tu Tien heard, the more one thing became clear. Jack had made mistakes. He had trusted the wrong person. He had failed to control everything happening inside the company. But he was not the kind of man who would intentionally build danger into a bridge. That distinction mattered to her, and she prayed it would matter to the police too. Inside the detention room, Jack was living through the longest days of his life. Time moved strangely there. Hours felt like they were standing still. Questions came again and again, not always in the same order, but always circling the same painful center. Material logs, missing signatures, supplier discrepancies, approval chains. Phuc's role, his own role. The company's financial pressure. Whether he had known about substitutions, whether he had benefited from them, whether he had chosen to ignore warning signs. Jack answered as steadily as he could. Yes, he had relied too much on Phuc. Yes, he had let too much internal coordination pass through the assistant's hands. Yes, the company had been desperate for money. But no, he had not ordered any falsified records. No, he had not approved cheaper, unsafe materials knowingly. No, he had not wanted any shortcut that could risk lives. Even so, every answer felt incomplete against the weight of the reality in front of him. The bridge had collapsed, people could have died, and the failure had happened under his company's name. That fact hung over everything. In another room, Phuc was beginning to break. The young man who had once spoken with confidence and energy now looked pale and exhausted. Under continued questioning, his explanations became more unstable. At first, he tried to avoid responsibility. He hinted that everyone had known the company was under pressure. He suggested that some substitutions were only temporary or minor. But the investigators kept pressing. They showed him signatures, payment records, routing notes, missing verification steps, conversations tied to supplier changes. Little by little, the walls around him began to crack. He admitted to handling more of the internal paperwork than he had first claimed. He admitted to pushing through certain supplier adjustments. He admitted that he had hidden some changes because he feared Jack would stop the work if he knew. But even then, he tried to soften the truth by saying he had only wanted to help the company save money and survive. That was the sentence that hurt Jack most when he eventually heard about it. Help the company survive. Because in trying to save it that way, Phuc had destroyed everything. By the third day, Tu Tien was finally allowed to see Jack briefly. The moment she saw him, her chest tightened. He looked more tired than she had ever seen him. His face was drawn, his eyes darker, his posture heavier. And yet when he saw her, the first thing he did was try to look calm for her sake. That only made it hurt more. Tu Tien sat down across from him, gripping her hands tightly to stop them from trembling. "Jack," she said softly. Jack looked at her for a moment, and all the strength he had been forcing onto his face seemed to loosen just a little. "You shouldn't be running around like this," he said quietly. "You just got out of the hospital." Tu Tien shook her head immediately. "How can I rest when you're here?" Jack lowered his eyes. For a second, neither of them spoke. There were too many emotions between them, too many things they wanted to say, and not enough time. Then Tu Tien leaned forward slightly. "I found a lawyer," she said. "I'm gathering statements, records, anything that can help. The people from the site remember your warnings. They remember how careful you were. I'm not stopping, Jack. I'm going to do everything I can." Jack looked up at her again, and for the first time since being taken in, something shifted in his expression. Not relief, but warmth. Painful, fragile warmth. "You've already done too much," he said. "No," Tu Tien replied, her voice steady now. "Not yet." Jack stared at her, and in that moment, it became painfully clear to him how much she was holding herself together for his sake. She was frightened, exhausted, still recovering from the shock that had sent her to the hospital, and yet she was the one standing outside, dealing with lawyers, workers, records, rumors, and her own fear, just to keep him from drowning in this alone. "I'm sorry," Jack said quietly. "I dragged you into all of this." Tu Tien's eyes filled instantly. "You didn't drag me anywhere," she whispered. "I chose to stand beside you. So now let me do that." Jack looked away for a moment, jaw tightening. It was the closest he had come to breaking since the case began. Before their meeting ended, Tu Tien reached across and held his hand for a brief second. "Listen to me," she said. "You cannot give up. Whatever happens, you cannot give up." Jack held her gaze and nodded slowly. After she left, that moment stayed with him. For the first time since the police had taken him in, the walls of the room felt a little less suffocating. Nothing had changed about the case itself. He was still under investigation. The company was still in crisis. Phuc's actions were still dragging everything downward. but Tu Tien's voice remained in his mind like something solid he could hold on to. Outside, Tu Tien kept moving. Inside, Jack forced himself to stay steady. And between them, one question still remained unanswered. Would truth be enough to bring Jack back to freedom, or would the consequences of Phuc's betrayal pull them both into an even darker chapter?